steps to living in more of God's freedom. And so I want to start off asking you the question, is there ever that time when you feel like, you want to do the right thing and you don't? You do the wrong thing? Can anybody relate to that or just me? Okay, we got a few of us here, right? So I want to read the scripture to you to start with. And this is in Romans 7, and it's 19. And this is Paul talking. And he says, "For the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that's what I practice." So it's all about sometimes we try to do the right thing, but we end up doing the wrong thing in the process. And so I just want to, kind of start off with, does anybody in here feel like they've ever done anything bad in their life? I mean, I can raise my hand. I got my hand up. Well, there was a guy in Scripture named Paul. And what Paul did is he murdered thousands of Christians. So who's murdered thousands of Christians? Besides Paul. None of us, right? We haven't done that. Well, the amazing part, though, is what God did with Paul's life. So Paul was a man that started out. He started out as Saul. And he was in charge of murdering Christians, is what he did. I mean, that was his purpose or his mission in life. And then God got a hold of him and kind of transformed his life. And in the process, this man turned into being the second greatest man in Christianity. So that's a pretty big transformation, right? To go from murdering Christians to being transformed by God. And it was nothing that Paul did. God had a hold of Paul's heart. And so he transformed him. And so he used him in the purpose of, connecting and being this great man of Christianity. And the other thing is, if you read the New Testament, Paul's responsible for 13 of the 24 books. So it's pretty impressive, right? And so the part is Paul knew the 3 steps. One of the steps is knowing your identity. And so that's such an important thing because a lot of times we think, significance. We want to get significance in this world. I know, most of my life I've always tried to find significance. Whether it was through a woman, whether it was through a job, it doesn't matter what it's through. If you've been part of, any type of group, any type of a gang is all about significance. You want to be seen a certain way. You want respect. And as long as you're searching after that, I mean, it's hard because the world's always going to tell you lies. The world's not going to give you truth at all. If you go out there every day, the message out in the world is basically you're not good enough, you don't have what it takes, you're lacking, somehow you're inadequate. That's the world's message. And as long as you take that in, I mean, what's that going to develop? I mean, I've taken in a lot of that before, and you're not going to be happy from that at all, right? It's not going to do anything to inspire you at all. And so the first thing is you have to know your identity, how God sees you. God says some pretty amazing stuff about us, and it's not based on our behavior at all. God says that we're His masterpiece. I mean, can you imagine? It's like somebody calling you a masterpiece. When I think of a masterpiece, I think of like a Picasso piece of art. That's a masterpiece. The other thing God says is that you're complete in Him. So you're not lacking anything at all. Sometimes we think we're inadequate or we don't have anything that's useful. Well, that's a bunch of garbage. God says that you're complete in Him. He says He has great plans for your life. And I know that's hard at times, especially when we're in difficult situations. But once again, getting back to Paul, I don't know how much you know about Paul. I studied Paul quite a bunch. But Paul was a man who spent most of his time in prison. And so I actually had a chance to visit the prison that Paul was in. I visited 6 years ago to it. And Paul was in a prison that was down in the ground, and he was shackled up the entire time he was in prison. So he was shackled, and in those days, sewage came from the bottom of the ground. And so Paul was in sewage the majority of the time. And there was a grate up above, and they dropped food down to Paul. So can you imagine? It's like here you're living, you're in a prison, and you're in sewage. And sewage is up to your knees. I mean, I complain all the time thinking I have it bad. But compared to Paul, I mean, it's not even close. And then on top of that, Paul was shipwrecked 3 times. Back in those days, shipwrecks were pretty bad. Paul was flogged on 5 different occasions. Does anybody know what flogging is? You ever heard of flogging? Flogging is basically when they rip the flesh off of your body. This is what they did to Paul. And they did it not once, but they did it on 5 occasions. They flogged him. And so they would always flog people 39 times. Because on the 40th time, they would actually kill the person. So Paul went through that 5 times. And back in those days, they didn't have medical care. There were no bandages. So Paul was beaten most of the time. He talks about he was starving. You know, he was shipwrecked. He was even bit by a poisonous snake. I mean, the guy had everything possible happening to him. But still, God used him in the process. And when they asked Paul, it's like, Paul, you know,